we grow up in the West thinking of the Sistine Chapel as being the ultimate expression of Christian art and painting. It's just like for an Orthodox Christian, and once you become Orthodox, it's like, whoa, you have different eyes to see through.
Yeah.
It seems like a total departure from true Christian painting with all the naked, muscular bodies and all the fleshy kind of emphasis upon a secular, a very human or naturalistic human beauty, not
Mhm.
one that's transfigured by the incarnation, by the presence of the Holy Spirit, but
Father John Strickland, welcome aboard for actually our third conversation. Nice to have you back.
good to be with you, Paul.
Great. So, if anybody hasn't seen our previous conversations, I think the first one was called "Why Men Must Master History." Was our first conversation,
Mhm.
and yeah, I really recommend people to go look at those. But because we're going to be taking a bit of a deeper dive today into a subject that I think is super interesting. It's really based on my reading your Paradise and Utopia series. It's actually a four-volume history of Christendom in the West, which completely moved me from not really understanding everything about why my society is today the way it is to having a far, far deeper insight and really inspired understanding where you don't just go through like the development of thoughts, but you're ready to actually describe the people behind the thoughts, which I would say nothing has done so much as to me to really understand the predicament of the West and my own
Mhm.
society here in Denmark as that has. So thank you very much for that. And I really recommend, yeah, look at the previous conversations, but also check out the books. Really easy to understand. And even though it's four volumes, it's fast packed, paced, and full of action. I normally say it's like an Orthodox Tom Holland. If people have heard of Tom Holland, his book Dominion, I'd say it's the Orthodox,
Mhm.
far more deeper dive version of that. I don't know if that's what you also see it as, Father John.
Yeah. I Tom Holland's book. I did read it when it came out, and I realized at that time I was obviously undertaking a project that had some similarities, but quite a bit different too, in other
Mhm.
respects. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Maybe I'll just mention before we dive into the main topic, which is going to be Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, and looking at these two men and their take on the kind of, or even the influence that they've had on our society. I just saw that, I think you were over and visited Charlie Kirk down in Phoenix. Is that correct?
Yes, I was.
Yeah. How was
Yeah.
that, Father John? How did that happen to happen?
Well, yeah, I was invited to come and speak on his show because he had learned that he's evangelical Protestant. He has connections to Roman Catholic figures as in addition to that, but he knew nothing about, or he claimed to know nothing about Orthodoxy, and he wanted someone to give an account of Orthodox Christianity and he asked me to come and do an interview on his Charlie Kirk show program. So I did that with him in his studio there in Phoenix, and it was a good conversation. I mean, my goal in doing it was to introduce him and through him his audience, mostly I assume evangelical Protestants and maybe Roman Catholics as well, to Orthodox Christianity, which I called and which is often called the best kept religious secret in the West.
Hmm.
Because we grow up just learning nothing about it. It's either Protestantism or Roman Catholicism, and those are your options. And so I think he was interested in learning like what's unique about Orthodoxy and also what's what's shared, and there are things that are shared. And I wanted to bring some attention to that too. But I tried to just speak about the Orthodox faith. I didn't want to get into politics. I didn't want to get into culture wars or anything like that. We didn't, and it was really, I think, a really nice interview. I enjoyed meeting him. And being given by him a chance to talk about the Orthodox faith a bit.
Glory to God, that's fantastic. And yeah, there might even be someone watching this conversation now who saw you there and then have been looking further and saw this pop up. So welcome if everybody is come that way, and maybe we can give a little bit of a deeper insight in some of the ideas that you've been putting through. And I think Dostoevsky and Nietzsche are really a fantastic place to start to really understand where we are today from an Orthodox perspective. So what we're really going to look at is how these guys kind of the difference between what we call an Orthodox phronema, and we'll get into what that means, and then the secular mindset that we just basically grow up with and assume to be the truth. So it's some very deep-seated differences between these two approaches to understanding life and the world and what's happening. And so before we get into that, then Father John, can you kind of paint the scene broadly in kind of big strokes? And I know this is exactly what you've written this four-volume book about, so I'll leave it up to you how much you're going to go into detail. But what is Christendom, and how have we, particularly in Western Christendom, arrived at this point where we get to Dostoevsky and Nietzsche in the in their time? Yeah, some what yeah, let's start with that. Yeah,
Okay.
what is Christendom, and how what are the broad approaches of how it develops to when these two guys arrive on the scene?
Yeah, that's a big and a great question, and I think these two figures speak so much to our generation, which I call an age of nihilism, because they really are a turning point. They really, not just a turning point, but they really do capture what's going on in our culture, and it's still very much like what's going on in our culture a century or more than a century after they were both writing and expressing their views. And I see this all as being necessarily placed in a historical context. I'm an historian by training. I see everything, historically laid out. I never see something by itself, but I see the history and the circumstances that it grew out of, and that it expressed a lineage going back, a sequential logic that led to it from the past. And in my case, I'm interested in the deep past, not just a past when we're studying our culture, that is, that takes us back to the, I don't know, the 60s or something like that, the, sexual revolution, hippie movement, something like that, where obviously a lot of things really radically began to change. Or back to something like the Enlightenment, so-called, where there was a radical and fundamental shift in our understanding of the world and God and religion and things like that, science. Or back to the Reformation, which broke in the West from Roman Catholicism. Or back to even some elements of Roman Catholicism in what's called the Middle Ages, like nominalism, which many see as being an important turning point. For me, the big turning point that led to Dostoevsky and Nietzsche that we'll be talking about today, and to so many of the big things that characterize Western culture, the big turning point is the Great Division, the Great Schism, historically dated to 1054, though that's just a kind of a convenient date that one can use to mark the moment when the Roman Catholic Church was separated from the Orthodox Church through an act of excommunication. And from that moment, really, certainly from that couple hundred years period, and that's 1,000 years ago, right? So that's 1,000 years into the history of Christianity. Or put differently, it's 1,000 years back from where we are today. And you mentioned my book series. The first volume, Age of Paradise, talks about when East and West were united together in one, not only in one church, sacramentally, ecclesiologically, but also in one culture. But after the Great Schism, 1054 is a convenient date for it, the Great Division, the West becomes less and less attached to the East, and in fact severs herself self-consciously from the East, and that puts the West on a trajectory that leads to a lot of the things that we think of as being like characteristically the West. So when we think about the West, we have all sorts of things we might be able to come up with historically. They'd all be valid, but almost every one of them belongs to the past 1,000 years, not to the first 1,000 years. Almost no one comes up with a sense of what it means to be Western, and then they think of, I don't know, Irish Christianity in the Celtic period, or early Anglo-Saxon Christianity, Lindisfarne, whatever you want to do with that, or many other elements or aspects of Western culture in Italy and Rome, when Rome was integrated very closely to Greek culture, and popes were actually recruited from Greece and Syria and Palestine to come rule in Rome as the pope. This all belongs to the first millennium, and it's that West that I think we need to recover. It's that deep past of our culture that we need to be better informed about and think more about. And we don't. And so the West simply becomes for us a sequence of events that more or less begin with, the papal crusades or Inquisition or, emperors and kings and the Reformation and the Enlightenment and so on all the way down to the present. Well,
Mhm.
that is indeed part of the West, but it's not the part that forms the West. And I think what we want to do is be able to go back and take seriously and look at that first millennium, that first 1,000-year period of time, and say, okay, this is how the West once was.
Mhm.
This is how the West once was. What happened to change it so that today, it's so different than it was back then? We can look at
Mhm.
all the stuff going on today and think about that. So when
Mhm.
I think about Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, as we'll talk about today, it's inevitable that I put them in this context, and they're a long-term outcome, 400 years after the Great Schism, of developments in our culture that led toward them and toward the nihilism that both of them were grappling with. The big problem of their day was, in their mind, nihilism. Like, what do we do if, as Nietzsche puts it, God is dead and there's nothing to believe in anymore?
Mhm.
Or as Dostoevsky's character puts it, without God, anything becomes permissible.
Mhm.
And indeed, that's kind of what the 20th century, the past 100 years, have revealed to us. They've lived out these nihilistic values. And
Mhm.
so all of this, and to conclude here, Paul, is a part of the history of Christendom.
Mhm.
Christendom. So I define Christendom as a civilization. It's not a church. It's not the church. It's not all the different churches together. And
Mhm.
it's certainly not the church in a certain period of time. A lot of people think of the Roman Catholic Middle Ages, so-called, as like the height of Christendom. Somehow, I don't think that's a very effective or useful, helpful way of using that term, that word. I see Christendom as a civilization that sprang out of Christianity, that can be dated back to Pentecost itself, and that is a civilization with a supporting culture that directs its members toward the heavenly transformation of the world.
Mhm.
And it's the alteration, change, and decline and fall of Christendom that really marks the second millennium in the history of the West. And that's why it's worth talking about figures like Nietzsche and
Mhm.
Dostoevsky in that context.
Yeah. As you were giving your explanation, Father John, I was actually thinking of the parable that Christ gives about the field that gets planted with a crop, and then the tares grow up, like an enemy
Hmm.
comes and sows tares, actually.
Yeah.
Um, and I think for pretty much anybody, at least I imagine someone who's found this video, they probably noticed that there's some very seriously dysfunctional aspects in our culture, which one can look at as like, weeds that are coming up and choking the good crop that's there in many ways. And I guess that's what a lot of people are looking for. And what you said, I think you said something like with Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, really some of these you can find the seeds in that great schism for some of these tears that have come. And then things got crystallized very clearly, like expressed very clearly, because culture was moving towards this kind of like degradation of an understanding of God. And then with them, they were the ones who actually were able to very clearly look at that issue, that problem, be honest about it, and somehow draw like the conclusions about like what does that actually mean?
Yeah.
Does that align?
Yeah. I mean, that's my project, I guess,
Yeah.
you know, in the 4 volumes and things like that. That's my goal, is to be able to say, okay, let's I mean, we get a lot out of like modern West critiques and culture critique and all that stuff. We get a lot out of these histories. I think of Rod Dreher in his Benedict option study of kind of where the West is, and very brief and not very historically kind of grounded, but
Hmm.
kind of very brief kind of reflection on kind of where Christians anyway are today in the
Hmm.
West. And there are many other examples of that. You mentioned Tom Holland, and he was grappling with, like, how do we make sense of the place of Christianity in the history of the West?
Hmm.
And he came up with his own conclusions, different, actually quite substantially different than mine,
Yeah. He didn't even
but very
mention the Orthodox
sympathetic.
Church either, right?
What's that?
I don't think he mentioned Orthodoxy anywhere in his
Oh
book.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Just
He
completely.
doesn't, I don't think. I mean, not significantly, not at all. It's just not part of the. Again, Orthodoxy is the best kept religious secret in the West.
Yeah.
So almost no one really knows about it. And when they do talk about it, they often, prefer to use a small O orthodoxy, spell orthodoxy that way, kind of downplay the ecclesial element of what
Yeah.
an Orthodox Christian considers to be the Church of Christ planted 2 millennia ago at Pentecost. And
At the end of this month and every single month going forward, we're going to be running something called a Genesis workshop, which is going to be an opportunity for you to go back to first principles and to formulate some daily habits that you'd like to be doing in your life to get a fresh start. If that sounds like something you'd like to sign up for, costs 17 euros, that's about 20 US dollars, then we have spaces available. Check out the link in the description below. Thanks.
And in my book series, I do actually talk a lot about, after that first millennium, about Eastern Christendom, and how it continued very much like that first millennium, at least up until the time when it became westernized, in the case of Russia, by people like Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. And in fact, we need to have a sense of that if we're going to talk intelligently about Dostoevsky.
Yeah.
But that is the project. The project is to see this as a history with a deep past, not a recent past that's only a few decades or a few centuries old, but the deepest possible origins of where we are today.
Yeah. So if we could just spend a little bit, maybe another couple of minutes talking about the problem that these both two guys, you mentioned that they both kind of saw this issue of increasing non-belief in God, God being dead, everything suddenly becomes permissible. Um, Maybe you can just like, I don't know if there's some important turning points of like where this came from, like what was the process? Maybe that's too far, but if you can just talk about what they saw. What did Dostoevsky and Nietzsche actually see? What was the kind of shared realization or understanding they had? And maybe even then the underlying reason for such a drastic difference in their solutions that they proposed then.
Yeah. Well, the leaders of historical movements are um, always introduce what become unintended consequences.
Yeah.
So no one at the Great Schism in the West wanted to see Nietzsche arise, on
Mhm.
the future horizon. He would be just, I mean, it's unthinkable, right? So these were pious Christians who were now Roman Catholic Christians under the papacy, beginning to develop a culture accordingly that began to deviate more and more from first millennium Western Christianity, Western Orthodoxy. But the unforeseen consequences, nevertheless, began almost immediately. And so, if you're looking for kind of like some of the big turning points or the most important moments that lead us up to Nietzsche declaring that God is dead, I think one of them certainly is what's often called the High Middle Ages. And again, we just have to relearn our history. The Middle Ages is an abominable term to use for Christians. Now, for a secular world, that might make sense in a certain way, but it was really coined by non-Christian or even anti-Christian historians and writers. And the idea of a Middle Ages dismisses everything that's going on by indicating or suggesting that it simply makes up a middle ground between one thing and something that follows it. And so there's a modern, it's called the tripartite model of history, where you have a classical age, which is pagan, okay, where the arts flourish, for instance.
Mhm.
You think of Greek, sculpture and drama and things like this, which, by the way, Nietzsche would look back to and just love and wish that could be restored.
Mhm.
It's grounded in paganism. Okay, so pagandom. It's the culture of pagandom.
Mhm.
And then Christianity is introduced after Pentecost and becomes predominant after Constantine. That's the fourth century, still first millennium there. And then you have and then the Middle Ages start, and there's no real definite beginning point for that. But the Middle Ages are dismissed by historians who introduced and coined that term as something that kind of disrupts the glory of the West in its pagan form and kind of dominates or kind of fills up space, cultural space, until the Renaissance, the 16th century secular Renaissance, frees up the West again from Christianity's, death hold. It's chokehold on good art and good culture.
Mhm.
That's not my attitude, but obviously that was the attitude of a lot of people
Mhm.
who used this term, the Renaissance and the Middle Ages and things like that.
Mhm. In my
And
schooling,
so,
actually, the Dark Ages was the term that was used, and it was
yeah, I mean, that's
explicitly
even
mentioned this
more,
was like a period of ignorance and darkness where no one knew
yeah,
anything, basically. That was.
exactly, and the Dark Ages, kind of were exposed by what's called the Enlightenment, another term I don't use, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if one's a Christian, you're using those terms, it's just like there's something wrong because the Enlightenment was basically about eradicating Christianity from our culture. I mean,
Mhm.
in the broadest sense, and the people, the leadership of the Enlightenment were apostate Christians. Voltaire was baptized and rejected his baptism. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the same. Thomas Jefferson, president of our country in America, a Francophile enlightened thinker, so-called. But
Mhm.
Christians believe that at Pentecost light comes into the world, that Christ, according to John's gospel, is the light of the world, the light of the cosmos,
Mhm.
and it's darkness without that light. And there's almost like turning that on its head with this term, the Enlightenment, to refer to the secularization of the 18th century and beyond. And I rewrite all of this history. It's kind of a provocative narrative that I present, asking people to consider radically reconsidering how we look at our culture and its history.
Yeah.
And so these turning points we were talking about there include not only what's called the Middle Ages, because what happens then is more and more attention becomes focused on Christ's suffering on the cross as something that should cause deep anguish and a sense of guilt in the people who contemplate it. And there's
Mhm.
actually writers from from the period of the after the Great Schism, where there's a real intensity. You can see like images, for instance, of the crucifixion, like paintings that show Christ in the most bloody, horrifying, jaw-dropping agony, just hideous to behold, in order to provoke a sense of guilt and anxiety in the person looking at it.
Mhm.
That's not historically how Christ's crucifixion was depicted in the first millennium. There he was shown as victorious over death, that his death on the cross, which involved real suffering, unspeakable suffering, nevertheless is not depicted in a bloody graphic way, but it's
Mhm.
depicted in a way that's serene, showing his majesty, his beauty. And there are many other examples of the contrast between first millennium Christianity, Christendom, and that which began to focus on how miserable this world is and man's place in it. One
Mhm.
other, just kind of throw out an example. So many that I use a document in my book called The Age of Division, which talks about this period after the Great Schism. Another example is a book, almost a bestseller at its time, if there was such a thing in that time, by one of the popes, one of the most important popes, Innocent III. Just before he became pope, he wrote a book called "The Misery of the Human Condition," "The
Mhm.
Misery of the Human Condition," and subtitle "On Contempt for the World."
Mhm.
And again, this has its origins in an authentic Christian experience of the Christian's place is not in this world, but belongs to the kingdom of heaven beyond this world. But what the first millennium did with all the church architecture and the beautiful iconography and all the other things that were being done was to show that the kingdom of heaven has come into this world, that the world is beautified by the presence or light of Christ, that this world is no longer just a place of darkness and sin, but that man has been raised up and dignified through his baptism into Christ and through the incarnation of God in Christ. Divinity has been joined to humanity, and the human being is a beautiful, dignified being now in the life of the church. That gets terribly like distorted by what happens in the West after the Great Schism, and the result is some cultural artifacts like those I just referred to, and then you have the wars of Western religion, the religious wars between Protestants and Roman Catholics after the Protestant Reformation, where millions of people are killed, put to death in the name of the God of love. And
Mhm.
so after these wars are over, the 30 Years' War ending in 1648 being the worst of them, you have this reaction among the intellectual leadership of the West, which largely repudiates Christianity and tries to create a peaceful, prosperous, and glorious world on its own terms without God's interaction, without Christianity playing any role. That's
Mhm.
called deism and the Enlightenment Project, it was called. And that introduces now, that severs the union between heaven and earth that the
Mhm.
first millennium exhibited in the West, and which the Orthodox Church, Eastern Christendom, continued to exhibit after the Great Schism
Yeah.
in places
And
like Russia.
I think the third volume in the series is the Age of Utopia, which I really
That's
appreciated understanding how, if you define Christendom as a civilization with a supporting culture aimed at the transformation of the world to the kingdom of heaven, and
Mhm.
and that's paradise. You're introducing paradise into the world, primarily in the hearts of men, as I understand it. Really, that's where it's happening, and increasingly, then instead of paradise then we people give up on the idea of paradise. They see the distraction through this distortion of the ideas of Christianity, and thus the project just goes for utopia instead, which of course means nowhere, which a lot of people have forgotten about today.
Yeah.
But and so it becomes a man-made utopia that we're through ideologies aiming to establish.
By the 19th century. And so the Enlightenment project, collapses or goes on the wrong direction during the French Revolution with its terror and Napoleonic Wars and stuff like that. But in the 19th century, which is relatively peaceful in Europe, in the European West, you get this effort to create ideologies that will then create a perfect world. And
Hmm.
you get this, this sometimes called the age of progress. And you get
Hmm.
all these examples, of John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism as a kind of philosophy of an atheistic philosophy or ethics system. He being an atheist, or you get Karl Marx, with his Marxism and how revolutionary conflict is going to create a perfect world, a
Hmm.
communist utopia. And we could talk about many other examples. So, what we have by the time Nietzsche comes along in the late 19th century is a conviction not just that Christianity, should be like left out of the picture, but that Christianity is absolutely wrong and that the only real solid intellectually respectable position is that there is no God at all. And so atheism, yeah, just not agnosticism, but real atheism becomes really widespread. I mean, we could go down a list of lots of philosophers who really shape the West, the history of the West in the 19th century, who were convinced that there is no God and it's man's calling to create a system of thinking about things
Hmm.
without God. And again, this all can be dated back and see its origins in that Great Schism and the severance of this union between heaven and earth.
Hmm.
Man left alone in the seculum, especially after the Renaissance, now tries to make the secular world, the seculum, his home. And atheism is like a inevitable outcome of that project. And that's where Nietzsche comes in and where we might want to, introduce him here somewhere as
Hmm.
someone who had, as an atheist, had something to say about this project to create an atheistic, secular utopia.
Hmm. Yeah. One thing that I just wanted to add in that I really appreciated from the book is the way you kind of look at art and culture, music, our appreciation of music and our consumption of it as well, how that kind of morphs and changes from, in the kind of in the age of paradise, then it's really through the church that we experience all of these
Mhm.
things. And there, again, all of our culture, all of our, entertainment that we would call it today is really aimed at this purpose of the transformation of the world to paradise. And so then slowly you see, first of all, just with the Enlightenment, how even the Catholic Church adopts a far more, pagan approach. If you look at the paintings on the Sistine Chapel, they look pretty similar to the pagan paintings of ancient Greece, right? And
Oh,
so that
I
entire
mean,
ethic.
off the charts, Paul. I mean, we grow up in the West thinking of the Sistine Chapel as being the ultimate expression of Christian art and painting. It's just like for an Orthodox Christian, and once you become Orthodox, it's like, whoa, you have different eyes to see through.
Yeah.
It seems like a total departure from true Christian painting with all the naked, muscular bodies and all the fleshy kind of emphasis upon a secular, a very human or naturalistic human beauty, not
Mhm.
one that's transfigured by the incarnation, by the presence of the Holy Spirit, but one that's just like in the pagandom of the Greeks, just a celebration of the flesh.
Yeah.
And if you look at, St. Peter's Basilica, another good example for our culture as a monument of Christian architecture, it's really, from an Orthodox point of view, a monument of the departure from Christian culture. Because while it's Christian in content, it's a Christian temple, it's
Mhm.
pagan in form. It's modeled on all the temples of the pagan Greeks, with its colonnades and its pediments and the dedicatory a statement across the front of it dedicated to the Pope who built it. And you can read that right along the front. His name winds up right where you enter St. Peter's Basilica through the front doors. That Pope's name is right over. It's just it's so arranged that the statement, this is dedicated by the Pope, such and such a Pope. His name appears right over the door. So it's again, it's really a secular monument.
Yeah.
But again, that's just we're trained in our culture to think of this as being like this is Christianity in its most kind of pure architectural form. That's just not true at all. There's so many good examples of beautiful Western, Latin, Christian temples. But that's not, I mean, that's a beautiful temple. Obviously, it's beautiful by secular standards, but there's nothing transfiguring about it. There's nothing about a heavenly transformation in that, borrowing from the pagan Greeks. It
Yeah.
remains secular.
Yeah. Okay. So, Father John, I was going to say, like, I think the next thing is to start moving towards this is to understand this idea of the phronema, the Orthodox phronema. But maybe we need to keep that for the next conversation. We've hit the half hour here.
Mhm.
So we got through our setting the scene basically here, I think. Yeah, maybe you just want to lay up a little bit of where we're going to be going, talking about this, what it is that the Orthodox see as the phronema, and how do we go about recovering that if we're going to get back to something, the good at the heart of Christendom that came from Pentecost.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great transition point because if we're going to next talk about this idea of a phronema, a way of thinking that's uniquely first millennium, uniquely Orthodox from an Orthodox point of view, then that's going to give us those eyes to see
Mhm.
what's going on in our culture today, but also what has been going on for the past 1,000 years since the Great Schism, and where someone like Nietzsche fits into that.
Mhm.
Again, just from a Western point of view, without an Orthodox phronema, Nietzsche might be seen as, in a variety of ways, and there's different views of Nietzsche, obviously, among philosophers and cultural thinkers of our time. But none of those are really particularly shaped by first millennium Christianity, traditional Christianity, Orthodox Christianity. And so I think, if we're going to continue this next time, I think maybe we would do start with that idea of so what are the bases and characteristics of an Orthodox point of view that would enable us to see Nietzsche and the nihilism that was inspired by his thinking directly or indirectly or coincidentally in the past 100 years in our culture, and to see that afresh, to see it with perhaps the capacity to help solve some of the problems we see around us today.
Absolutely. Well, for me, it's been absolutely transformational for my life. I probably read your book like, 2 years into becoming Orthodox, and
Hmm.
still, I've grown up and I've breathed in the air of actually nihilism. I mean, Father Seraphim Rose has a book on nihilism, and I think that
Yeah,
really makes the case incredibly well. This is the food that it's the milk that we get in with our
yeah.
from our society, from our growing up, and so it's been a slow process of understanding and seeing through these things and understanding the way that from these initial departures. So understanding this deep past, I think, is certainly an incredibly valuable way for both me and my wife. Actually, we're both kind of had an experience of Jesus Christ and really seeing like this is the truth, but then looking like where's our spiritual home, then for us it was an
Hmm.
incredibly powerful thing to realize that every time we really dug into the depths of things, then the Orthodox Church just had it had the answers, the answers there. They just went far further back and really connected back into a line of personal transmission from Christ all the way through the ages that made sense. Things hadn't changed in the way that everything else is changing and is currently collapsing, I would say, around us. So yeah,
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation with you, Father John. Any last words before we close off here?
No,
Otherwise,
I look forward to talking to you, Paul, about the phronema that the
mm,
Orthodox Church cultivates, which the first millennium
mhm.
cultivated under the influence of traditional Christianity, and then looking at Nietzsche and Dostoevsky from that point of view. Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for your time, Father John. Much
Okay.
appreciated.